In February 1994, First Baptist Church of Smyrna, Tennessee, hired a new student minister. He was welcomed by a congregation of around 500 members and a ministry with close to 25 to 30 students. He came with his wife and 2 young boys. They moved from Texas, where he had been attending Southwestern Baptist Theological Seminary and serving at First Baptist Church, Greenville, Texas. His wife, Amy, asked early on in their time in Smyrna, "Why did you bring me to this town?" And the visionary, who we know as Pastor Pat Hood, replied, "Just give me a year and we will move somewhere else." Since that time, Pat has now celebrated 30 years of pastoral ministry at First Baptist Church of Smyrna, Tennessee, and what we now call LifePoint Church. That's nearly 11,000 days, close to 10,600 more than he promised Amy Hood.
From the beginning, when he was first hired as the student minister, he was determined to reach the students and young people, regardless of what the adults thought. Not only did more students and kids begin coming to the church, but so did their parents because of the excitement that was taking place in Pat's ministry.
He grew the student ministry and enlisted leaders who served in the ministry even long after their children left the ministry. His vision inspired people and leaders to minister. Dr. Hubbard, his friend and mentor, and the pastor who hired him, wasn't threatened by Pat's leadership ability serving under him. He helped to refine Pat's fire to be focused on the task ahead. When Dr. Hubbard passed the pastoral baton to Pat, he knew and was comforted knowing that Pat would serve and lead the church well.
Back in 2004, when Pat was celebrating 10 years at First Baptist Church, Smyrna, I'd been hired 2 years previously, and the church was going through our very first sacred gathering, where we fasted as a church and sought the will of the Father, and we were about to open the current auditorium at the Smyrna campus. During the sacred gathering, Psalm 46:10 came alive. It reads, "Be still and know that I am God." And the next part stood out even more clearly, "And I will be exalted among the nations. I'll be exalted in the earth." Well, in 2004, we opened the current auditorium at First Baptist Church. The growth and the grand opening allowed more and more people to come to our church, yet God was showing Pat that the ambitions and the goals would require some refocusing. You see, Pat realized it wasn't just about the number of people that came to our building. It was about the number of people that were being sent out of the building on mission in the community and around the world. Pat led the church to realize that missions wasn't about them, it was about the glory of God. In 2005, while on a mission trip in India, we were visiting, we were doing ministry, and Pat had a realization in his personal life and in his marriage life that greatly impacted the church. Pat witnessed Amy holding babies and the little children all throughout the villages, praying over them. You see, God had been working in Pat's heart to adopt. That's something that Amy had been praying for God to reveal to Pat. It was in those moments that Pat saw how his family needed to grow through international adoption, but it also catalyzed the church's new sending ministry. Pat knew early on in his ministry that in order for him to do what he felt like God had called him to do as a pastor, that he would need his wife to minister alongside him and minister to the women in the church. And Amy Hood stepped into that calling right next to her husband. In 2007, they welcomed their first adopted daughter, and then the following year, during our second sacred gathering, the picture became more clear as to how we would exalt Christ among the nations. That next year in 2008, God called our church to Brussels, Belgium. It was a place desperate for the gospel. The next year, we changed our name to LifePoint Church because our heart was pointing people to a Christ-centered life. That same year, we also launched the Stewart's Creek campus. Then a couple of years later, both the Brussels and the Bangkok campuses became a reality, followed shortly after by the Riverdale and College Grove campuses. While all of these steps along the timeline matter and are so meaningful to reflect on, one key thing needs to be mentioned. The church needed a leader to guide us through each of these moments. We needed a builder of ministry, a builder of people, a multiplier, someone bold enough to see what needed to be done and strong enough to lean into the Lord to make it happen. The mission was clear to him, and he helped make it clear to us. He stressed and felt and feels this responsibility constantly today. It weighed on him, and it weighs on him still. My friend, who was once a fun and energetic, sometimes reckless and loving youth pastor, became the God-anointed man needed to lead the church.
As the pastor who baptized Pat when he was 10 years old, I am proud to know him and to witness his enormous impact through the ministry of Jesus Christ.
Pat often shares the story of how we first met while standing in line to register for classes at seminary. It's crazy to think how I met my best friend so long ago and how the stories of our ministries are so intertwined with one another. One story I vividly remember is early in our relationship at seminary, we were sitting in a parking lot talking about what we desired in ministry, and he mentioned, I want to be a student pastor, an associate pastor, and then the lead pastor of that church. Only one church in my ministry. Wow. Pat, the Lord has allowed that to come true, hadn't he, bud?
He's a man filled with passion, some more passion, and then another dose of passion. His heart is fiery, yet focused. His name is synonymous with visionary.
Because of your heart for the lost, I stand as an example of one of the thousands of kids you lived out the gospel with, as one of those kids who surrendered their heart to the promise of Jesus, as one of the kids who followed in obedience of baptism, and one of the students who followed you as you followed the Lord. I followed in your footsteps into ministry and proudly declare the gospel because you modeled to me how to do so on football fields, in the pulpit, in my home, in coffee shops, and across the world. I'm grateful that you allowed a punk kid like me to dine at your table, to spend the night at your house and eat your food and wrestle in the living room and honestly do a whole lot of things that I probably shouldn't have been doing. Because you saw that I needed a father figure, but more importantly, you saw that I needed the gospel. Your obedience to the voice and heart of God has sustained you up until this point and will continue to sustain you moving forward. You are a model of integrity and influence. Pastors and wives of pastors are still leading churches today because the gospel was ingrained in them as the only source of life. They learned and saw that sharing the gospel was vital to their ministry, a ministry that started in their quiet time with the Lord, but also their time with their family and with their church. There are missionaries who sat under your teaching, whose feet right now are actively preaching the gospel, where less than 1% of people in that country know Jesus. But one of the most staggering aspects to consider is that while the number of people Pat has directly impacted is plentiful, the multiplied number that have been impacted and reached by those whom Pat impacted is unknown. What we do know is the gospel influence on the lives of people through Pat spans not only throughout the world, but throughout a multitude of generations.
He prayed for the nations and to see people unlike himself come into the church because the God of the nations is the God of all peoples. He heard from God, he discerned the leading, and then led us to follow God through that. He is obedient to what the Lord says, and the Lord has sustained Pat's ministry for 30 years.
So Pat, thank you. Over 30 years of service, sacrifice, suffering, success, favor and progress, prayer and preaching and devotion, loss, gain, interns, assistants, and ministries. We simply want to say thank you for 30 years of influence to serving God's church and advancing His kingdom.